In the 1950s and 1970s, our grandmothers knew how to make one-dish casseroles that mattered. Their work in the kitchen didn't just fill a plate. They mixed everything in one pan, baked it fast, and fed the family for under $1. These 30 forgotten casseroles might sound too simple today, but they kept families fed. Let's rediscover what grandmothers baked when they had 10 minutes and one dish. Creamy chicken biscuit bake wasn't fancy. It was supper when you needed protein, carbs, and gravy all in one dish. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Open a can of cream of chicken soup, dump it into a casserole dish, add leftover cooked chicken torn into pieces, top with canned biscuits straight from the tube, bake at 375 degrees for 20 minutes. On the smell was buttery biscuits and creamy chicken. The taste was comfort, soft biscuits, rich gravy, tender chicken. It cost about 75 cents in 1965. One can of soup, one tube of biscuits, leftover chicken from Sunday dinner. This worked because cream of chicken soup stacked in the pantry, biscuits kept in the icebox, and leftover chicken lasted 3 days. No chopping, no stirring, just dump, top, bake. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s when rotisserie chickens became common. But for seniors living alone, creamy chicken biscuit bake remained reliable. It was warm, filling, and tasted like someone cared. But if chicken felt too plain, what came next was heartier and browned in a skillet. Hamburger rice, skillet casserole, wasn't a recipe. It was supper when ground beef and rice were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef in a skillet, drain the grease, stir in 1 cup of uncooked instant rice, add 1 can of tomato soup, pour in 1 cup of water, cover, simmer for 10 minutes. The smell was browned beef and tomato. The taste was simple: savory meat, soft rice, tangy tomato sauce. It cost about 80 cents in 1965. Ground beef at 50 cents per pound, instant rice from the box, tomato soup from the pantry. This worked because ground beef was cheap, instant rice cooked in minutes, and tomato soup was always on hand. No casserole dish, no oven, just 1 skillet and a lid. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when boxed hamburger helper replaced homemade versions. But for seniors living alone, hamburger rice skillet casserole remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required 1 pan, but if ground beef felt too heavy, what came next was lighter and used potatoes. Cheesy potato and onion bake wasn't a side dish. It was supper when potatoes and cheese were all you could afford. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Slice potatoes thin, slice onions thin. Layer them in a greased casserole dish. Sprinkle shredded cheddar cheese between each layer. Pour 1 can of cream of mushroom soup over the top. Bake at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. The smell was melted cheese and soft onions. The taste was rich: tender potatoes, sharp cheese, creamy soup. It cost about 60 cents in 1955. Potatoes from the bin, onions from the crisper, cheese from the block, soup from the pantry. This worked because potatoes kept for weeks, onions lasted forever, and cheese was affordable. No chopping beyond slicing, no stirring, just layer, pour, bake. The meal stayed popular at church suppers and family dinners through the 1970s, but for seniors living alone, cheesy potato and onion bake remained filling. It was warm, cheap, and tasted like comfort. But if potatoes felt too starchy, what came next was faster and used pasta. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Beefy Elbow Mac skillet wasn't gourmet. It was supper when ground beef and macaroni were the only things left. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef in a skillet, drain the grease, add 2 cups of cooked elbow macaroni, stir in 1 can of tomato soup, add a handful of shredded cheese if you had it, heat until the cheese melted. And the smell was beef and tomato. The taste was simple. Savory meat, soft pasta, tangy sauce. It cost about 70 cents in 1965, ground beef at 50 cents per pound, elbow macaroni from the box, tomato soup from the pantry. This worked because ground beef was cheap, macaroni cooked in minutes, and tomato soup lasted forever. No casserole dish, no oven, just 1 skillet. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when boxed pasta dinners became popular. But for seniors living alone, Beefy Elbow Mac skillet remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required 1 pan. But if ground beef felt too repetitive, what came next used turkey and stuffing. Creamed turkey stuffing casserole wasn't Thanksgiving. It was supper when leftover turkey and stale bread were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Tear leftover turkey into pieces, dump it into a casserole dish, add torn pieces of stale bread or leftover stuffing, pour 1 can of cream of celery soup over the top, bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The smell was sage and cream. The taste was warm, soft turkey, savory stuffing, creamy sauce. It cost nothing in 1955. The turkey was leftover, bread was stale, soup was in the pantry. This worked because turkey lasted 3 days in the icebox, stale bread was always around, and cream of celery soup kept for years. No chopping, no mixing, just tear, dump, pour, bake. The meal stayed common through the 1970s after holiday dinners, but for seniors living alone, creamed turkey stuffing casserole remained practical. It used leftovers without waste, but if turkey felt too dry, what came next was greasier and used sausage. The first 5 casseroles were fast and cheap: creamy chicken biscuit bake, hamburger rice skillet, cheesy potato and onion bake, beefy elbow mac, and creamed turkey stuffing. But the next 5 go into breakfast territory. Sausage and hash brown bake wasn't breakfast. It was supper when you needed something fast and filling. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of breakfast sausage in a skillet, drain the grease, dump it into a casserole dish, add 1 package of frozen hash browns, pour 1 can of cream of mushroom soup over the top, sprinkle shredded cheese on top, bake at 375 degrees for 30 minutes. And the smell was browned sausage and melted cheese. The taste was rich: savory sausage, crispy hash browns, creamy soup. It cost about $1 in 1965, sausage at 60 cents per pound, frozen hash browns from the freezer section, soup from the pantry. This worked because sausage was cheap, hash browns cooked fast, and cream of mushroom soup was always on hand. No chopping, no stirring, just brown, dump, bake. The meal stayed popular at church breakfasts and family brunches through the 1990s. But for seniors living alone, sausage and hash brown bake remained practical. It was warm, filling, and tasted like breakfast for dinner. But if sausage felt too greasy, what came next was lighter and used rice. Tomato rice pantry casserole wasn't fancy. It was supper when tomato soup and rice were the only things in the cupboard. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Dump 1 can of tomato soup into a casserole dish. Add 1 cup of uncooked instant rice. Pour in 1 cup of water. The smell was tomato and steam. The taste was simple: tangy tomato, soft rice, warm and filling. It cost about 35 cents in 1965. 1 can of tomato soup, instant rice from the box, water from the tap. This worked because tomato soup stacked in the pantry for years, instant rice cooked fast, and water was free. No chopping, no browning, just dump, stir, bake. The meals stayed common through the 1970s when canned soups were kitchen staples, but for seniors living alone, tomato rice pantry casserole remained reliable. It was warm, cheap, and required no thought. But if tomato rice felt too plain, what came next was creamier and used noodles. Creamy noodle and pea bake wasn't a side dish. It was supper when noodles and frozen peas were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Cook egg noodles until soft, drain, dump them into a casserole dish, add 1 cup of frozen peas, pour 1 can of cream of chicken soup over the top, stir once, bake at 350 degrees for 20 minutes. The smell was creamy soup and soft noodles. The taste was mild, tender noodles, sweet peas, rich cream sauce. It cost about 50 cents in 1955. Egg noodles from the box, frozen peas from the freezer, soup from the pantry. This worked because noodles cooked fast, frozen peas lasted forever, and cream of chicken soup was always on hand. No chopping, no browning, just boil, dump, bake. The meal stayed popular at church potlucks and family dinners through the 1970s, but for seniors living alone, creamy noodle and pea bake remained practical. It was soft, warm, and easy to chew. But if noodles felt too soft, what came next was heartier and used biscuits. Ground beef gravy, biscuit casserole wasn't fancy. It was supper when ground beef and biscuits were all you could afford. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef in a skillet, drain the grease, stir in 1 can of brown gravy, pour it into a casserole dish, top with canned biscuits straight from the tube, bake at 375 degrees for 20 minutes. The smell was browned beef and buttery biscuits. No, the taste was comfort. Savory gravy, fluffy biscuits, tender beef. It cost about 80 cents in 1965. Ground beef at 50 cents per pound, brown gravy from the can, biscuits from the tube. This worked because ground beef was cheap, canned gravy lasted forever, and biscuits baked fast. No chopping, no mixing, just brown, pour, top, bake. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when biscuit-topped casseroles were popular, but for seniors living alone, ground beef gravy biscuit casserole remained reliable. It was warm, filling, and tasted like home, but if ground beef felt too heavy, what came next was lighter and used chicken. Chicken cornbread skillet bake wasn't Southern cooking. It was supper when leftover chicken and cornbread mix were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Tear leftover chicken into pieces, dump it into a greased skillet, pour 1 can of cream of chicken soup over the top, mix 1 box of cornbread mix according to package directions, pour the batter over the chicken, bake at 400 degrees for 25 minutes. The smell was cornbread and chicken. The taste was layered. Soft chicken, creamy soup, golden cornbread crust. It cost about 90 cents in 1965. Leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, cream of chicken soup from the pantry, cornbread mix from the box. This worked because chicken lasted 3 days, soup kept forever, and cornbread mix was cheap. No chopping, no stirring, just tear, dump, pour, bake. The meal stayed popular at church suppers and family dinners through the 1980s. But for seniors living alone, chicken cornbread skillet bake remained practical. It was warm, filling, and tasted like comfort. But if chicken felt too plain, what came next was richer and used mushroom soup. The first 10 casseroles were fast and cheap. Creamy chicken biscuit, hamburger rice, cheesy potatoes, beefy elbow mac, turkey stuffing, sausage hash browns, tomato rice, creamy noodles, ground beef gravy, and chicken cornbread. But the next 10 go deeper: mushroom rice, cheddar vegetables, beef and potato, tuna rice, and chicken with crackers. Creamy mushroom rice bake wasn't a side dish. It was supper when rice and mushroom soup were all you had left in the pantry. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Dump 1 cup of uncooked instant rice into a casserole dish. Pour 1 can of cream of mushroom soup over the top. Add 1 cup of water. Stir once. Sprinkle with a handful of shredded cheese if you had it, cover with foil, bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The smell was earthy mushrooms and steamed rice. The taste was creamy, soft rice, rich mushroom gravy, melted cheese on top. It cost about 40 cents in 1965. Instant rice from the box, cream of mushroom soup from the pantry, cheese from the block. This worked because instant rice cooked fast, cream of mushroom soup stacked on the shelf for years, and cheese was optional but added richness. No chopping, no stirring beyond 1 quick mix. Just dump, pour, stir, bake. Some seniors added a handful of frozen peas or canned mushrooms if they wanted more substance, but plain mushroom rice was more common. The meal stayed popular at church potlucks and family dinners through the 1980s, where it was served as a side dish alongside roast chicken or pork chops. But for seniors living alone, creamy mushroom rice bake was a complete meal. It was warm, filling, and tasted like comfort food without requiring meat. The mushroom soup provided protein and fat, the rice provided carbs, and the cheese provided calcium. It was soft enough to eat without teeth, easy to digest, and required only 1 dish to bake and 1 spoon to eat. By the 1990s, cream of mushroom soup casseroles started feeling outdated as fresh ingredients became more popular. But during the 1960s and 70s, creamy mushroom rice bake was a practical 1-dish casserole that delivered warmth and satisfaction without effort. But if mushroom rice felt too plain, what came next added vegetables and used cheddar. Cheddar vegetable skillet casserole wasn't healthy eating. It was supper when frozen vegetables and cheese were all you could manage. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Dump 1 bag of frozen mixed vegetables into a skillet, add 1 can of cream of celery soup, stir in 1 cup of shredded cheddar cheese, heat on the stove until the cheese melted and the vegetables softened, top with crushed crackers if you had them. The smell was melted cheese and soft vegetables. The taste was creamy, tender carrots, peas, corn, and green beans in a thick cheese sauce. It cost about 65 cents in 1965. Frozen mixed vegetables from the freezer section, cream of celery soup from the pantry, cheddar cheese from the block. This worked because frozen vegetables lasted forever. Cream of celery soup kept on the shelf for years, and cheddar cheese was affordable. No chopping, no peeling, no washing fresh vegetables. Just dump, stir, heat. Some seniors baked it in the oven for 20 minutes to get a crispy cracker topping, but stovetop was faster. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when frozen vegetables were considered modern and convenient. But for seniors living alone, cheddar vegetable skillet casserole was a practical way to eat vegetables without the effort of fresh produce. It was warm, cheesy, and filled half the plate. The vegetables were soft enough to chew without teeth, and the cheese sauce made them taste less bland. By the 1990s, fresh vegetable stir-fries and roasted vegetables replaced frozen casseroles. But during the 1960s and 70s, a cheddar vegetable skillet casserole was a practical 1-dish meal that delivered nutrition without effort. But if vegetables felt too boring, what came next was heartier and used beef. Beef and potato cream bake wasn't fancy. It was supper when ground beef and potatoes were all you had left. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef in a skillet, drain the grease, dump it into a casserole dish, slice potatoes thin, and layer them on top. Pour 1 can of cream of mushroom soup mixed with half a cup of milk over everything, cover with foil, bake at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. The smell was browned beef and baked potatoes. The taste was rich, savory beef, tender potatoes, creamy gravy. It cost about $1 in 1955, ground beef at 50 cents per pound. Or potatoes from the bin, cream of mushroom soup from the pantry, milk from the bottle. This worked because ground beef was cheap, potatoes kept for weeks, and cream of mushroom soup was always on hand. No complicated prep, no multiple pans, just brown, layer, pour, bake. Some families added sliced onions between the layers or sprinkled cheese on top before baking, but plain beef and potato was more common. The meal stayed popular at family dinners and church suppers through the 1970s, where it was called hamburger casserole or poor man's shepherd's pie. But for seniors living alone, beef and potato cream bake was a filling one-dish meal that used simple ingredients. The potatoes stretched the beef, and the cream soup made everything taste rich and satisfying. By the 1980s, our microwaves and prepackaged frozen dinners started replacing homemade casseroles. But during the 1950s and 60s, beef and potato cream bake was a practical way to feed a family or yourself without effort. But if beef felt too heavy, what came next was lighter and used tuna. Creamy tuna rice skillet wasn't tuna noodle casserole. It was supper when you were tired of noodles and wanted rice instead. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Open 1 can of tuna, drain the water, dump it into a skillet, add 1 cup of cooked instant rice, stir in 1 can of cream of celery soup, heat on the stove until everything was warm, top with crushed crackers if you had them. The smell was tuna and celery. The taste was creamy, flaky tuna, soft rice, rich soup. It cost about 60 cents in 1965, canned tuna from the pantry, instant rice from the box, cream of celery soup from the shelf. This worked because canned tuna lasted for years, instant rice cooked in minutes, and cream of celery soup kept forever. No oven, no casserole dish, just 1 skillet and a spoon. Some seniors added frozen peas or canned mushrooms to make it feel more substantial, but plain tuna rice was more common. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when canned tuna was a pantry staple. But for seniors living alone, creamy tuna rice skillet was a practical alternative to tuna noodle casserole. It was faster because instant rice cooked in 5 minutes, lighter because rice felt less heavy than pasta and easier to digest. The cream of celery soup was milder than cream of mushroom, which some people found too earthy. By the 1990s, fresh fish became more affordable and available, and canned tuna started feeling outdated. But during the 1960s and 70s, creamy tuna rice skillet was a practical one-dish meal that delivered protein without effort. But if tuna felt too fishy, what came next used chicken and crackers. Chicken and cracker crumb bake wasn't breaded chicken. It was supper when leftover chicken and stale crackers were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Tear leftover chicken into pieces, dump it into a casserole dish, pour 1 can of cream of chicken soup over the top, crush a sleeve of saltine crackers into coarse crumbs, sprinkle the crumbs on top, dot with a few pats of butter, bake at 375 degrees for 25 minutes. The smell was buttery crackers and chicken. The taste was layered. Soft chicken, creamy soup, crispy cracker topping. It cost about 70 cents in 1955, leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, cream of chicken soup from the pantry, saltine crackers from the box, butter from the icebox. This worked because chicken lasted 3 days in the icebox, soup kept forever, and crackers never went stale if you kept the box closed. No chopping, no mixing, just tear, dump, crush, sprinkle, bake. Some families used Ritz crackers instead of saltines for a richer flavor, but saltines were cheaper. The meal stayed popular at church suppers and family dinners through the 1970s, where it was called chicken cracker casserole or crumb-topped chicken. But for seniors living alone, chicken and cracker crumb bake was a practical way to use leftovers without waste. The crackers absorbed the soup and formed a golden crust that tasted like stuffing. By the 1980s, store-bought breadcrumbs replaced crushed crackers, and homemade casseroles started feeling old-fashioned. But during the 1950s and 60s, chicken and cracker crumb bake was a practical one-dish meal that turned leftovers into something new. But if chicken felt too plain, what came next was sweeter, and used corn. The first 15 casseroles were fast and filling: creamy chicken biscuit, hamburger rice, cheesy potatoes, turkey stuffing, sausage hash browns, mushroom rice, cheddar vegetables, beef and potato, tuna rice, and chicken with crackers. But the next 5 go into egg and vegetable territory: creamed corn, pork chop stuffing, lentil rice, cheesy bread cubes, and instant rice chicken. Creamed corn and egg bake wasn't breakfast. It was supper when canned corn and eggs were all you had left. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Open 1 can of creamed corn, dump it into a greased casserole dish, crack 4 eggs directly into the corn, stir gently so the eggs broke and mixed with the corn but didn't scramble completely, sprinkle with salt and pepper, bake at 350 degrees for 25 minutes until the eggs set. The smell was sweet corn and cooked eggs. The taste was soft. Creamy corn, silky eggs, slightly sweet. It cost about 40 cents in 1965, 1 can of creamed corn from the pantry, 4 eggs from the carton. This worked because creamed corn stacked on the shelf for years, eggs kept in the icebox for weeks, and you didn't need butter, milk, or cheese. No chopping. No stirring beyond 1 gentle mix. Just dump, crack, stir, bake. Some seniors added a handful of shredded cheese on top or crumbled bacon if they had leftovers, but plain corn and eggs was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1980s in the South and Midwest, where corn was plentiful and cheap. But for most Americans, creamed corn and egg bake was considered poverty food or farm food, something you ate when you had nothing else. Younger generations found the texture strange. The eggs set into soft curds, suspended in sweet creamed corn, creating a pudding-like consistency that was neither savory nor sweet. By the 1990s, creamed corn fell out of favor as fresh vegetables became more popular. But during the 1960s and 70s, creamed corn and egg bake was a practical one-dish meal that delivered protein and vegetables without effort. But if corn felt too sweet, what came next was savory and used pork chops. Pork chop stuffing skillet wasn't Thanksgiving. It was supper when pork chops and stale bread were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 4 pork chops in a skillet, remove them and set aside. Tear stale bread into pieces and dump it into the same skillet. Pour 1 can of chicken broth over the bread. Lay the pork chops on top, cover with a lid, simmer on low heat for 20 minutes. The smell was browned pork and sage. The taste was savory: tender pork chops, soft stuffing, rich broth. It cost about $1 in 1955, pork chops at 60 cents per pound, stale bread from the bread box, chicken broth from the can. This worked because pork chops were cheap, stale bread was always around, and chicken broth kept on the shelf forever. No oven, no casserole dish, just one skillet and a lid. Some families added diced onions or celery to the stuffing, but plain bread and broth was more common. Pork chop stuffing skillet was a practical way to cook meat and starch in one pan. But if pork chops felt too fatty, what came next was leaner and used lentils. Creamy lentil and rice bake wasn't vegetarian cooking. It was supper when lentils and rice were cheaper than meat. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Dump 1 cup of dried lentils into a casserole dish, add 1 cup of uncooked instant rice, pour 1 can of cream of mushroom soup over the top, add 2 cups of water, stir once, cover with foil, bake at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. The smell was earthy lentils and mushroom. The taste was hearty. Soft lentils, fluffy rice, creamy soup. It cost about 50 cents in 1965. Dried lentils from the bulk bin, instant rice from the box, cream of mushroom soup from the pantry. This worked because lentils were cheap, rice was cheap, and soup was cheap. No soaking, no pre-cooking, just dump everything raw into the dish and bake. Some seniors added diced onions or carrots if they had them, but plain lentil rice was more common. By the 1990s, lentils became trendy as health food. But during the 1960s and 70s, creamy lentil and rice bake was a practical casserole that cost almost nothing and filled you up. But if lentils felt too plain, what came next was richer and used bread cubes. Cheesy bread cube casserole wasn't stuffing. It was supper when stale bread and cheese were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Tear stale bread into cubes, dump them into a greased casserole dish, sprinkle shredded cheddar cheese between the layers, beat 2 eggs with 1 cup of milk, pour the egg mixture over the bread, let it soak for 5 minutes. Bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The smell was toasted bread and melted cheese. The taste was rich, soft bread pudding, sharp cheese, custard-like center. It cost about 50 cents in 1955. Stale bread from the bread box, cheddar cheese from the block, eggs from the carton, milk from the bottle. This worked because stale bread was free, cheese was affordable, and eggs and milk were always on hand. No chopping, no mixing beyond beating eggs. Just tear, layer, pour, bake. Some families added diced ham or cooked sausage to make it heartier, but plain bread and cheese was more common. By the 1980s, bagels and English muffins replaced plain white bread, and stale bread became less common. But during the 1950s and 60s, cheesy bread cube casserole was a practical one-dish meal that turned leftovers into something comforting. But if bread felt too heavy, what came next was lighter, and used instant rice. Chicken and instant rice bake wasn't a recipe, it was supper when leftover chicken and instant rice were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Tear leftover chicken into pieces, dump it into a casserole dish. Add 1 cup of uncooked instant rice, pour 1 can of cream of chicken soup over the top, add 1 cup of water, stir once, cover with foil, bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The smell was chicken and steam. The taste was simple: tender chicken, soft rice, creamy soup. It cost about 70 cents in 1965. Leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, instant rice from the box, cream of chicken soup from the pantry. This worked because chicken lasted 3 days in the icebox, instant rice cooked in minutes, and cream of chicken soup kept forever. No chopping, no browning, no pre-cooking the rice. Just tear, dump, pour, stir, bake. Some seniors added frozen peas or canned mushrooms for extra substance, but plain chicken and rice was more common. By the 1990s, rotisserie chickens and microwaves replaced leftover chicken casseroles. But during the 1960s and 70s, chicken and instant rice bake was a practical way to stretch Sunday's chicken into Monday's supper. But if chicken felt too dry, what came next was saucier and used gravy. The first 20 casseroles were fast, cheap, and filling: creamy chicken, hamburger rice, turkey stuffing, mushroom rice, beef and potato, tuna rice, corn and eggs, pork chop stuffing, lentil rice, cheesy bread cubes, and chicken with instant rice. But the final 10 go into the richest territory: gravy, spinach, biscuits, toast cubes, cornmeal, white beans, dumplings, vegetables, onions, and pantry pasta. Beef gravy potato skillet wasn't fancy cooking. It was supper when ground beef, potatoes, and a can of gravy were all you had left in the house. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef in a large skillet. Drain the grease, slice potatoes thin, and layer them on top of the beef. And pour 1 can of brown gravy over everything. Add half a cup of water. Cover with a lid. Simmer on low heat for 25 minutes until the potatoes were tender. The smell was browned beef and rich gravy. The taste was hearty: savory beef, soft potatoes, thick brown sauce. It cost about 90 cents in 1965. Ground beef at 50 cents per pound, potatoes from the bin, brown gravy from the can. This worked because ground beef was the cheapest meat, potatoes kept for weeks in the crisper, and canned brown gravy stacked on the shelf for years. No oven, no casserole dish, no multiple pans to wash, just 1 skillet with a lid. Some seniors added sliced onions between the beef and potatoes, or sprinkled black pepper on top before covering, but plain beef, potatoes, and gravy was more common. The meal stayed popular at family dinners and Sunday suppers through the 1980s, where it was called hamburger skillet or poor man's pot roast. Children loved it because the gravy made everything taste rich, and the potatoes soaked up all the beef juices. Adults appreciated it because it used simple ingredients and required minimal effort. The beef provided protein, the potatoes provided bulk, and the gravy tied everything together into something that felt like a complete meal. By the 1990s, microwaves and prepackaged frozen dinners started replacing stovetop skillets, and younger generations preferred faster meals that didn't require 25 minutes of simmering. But during the 1960s and 70s, beef gravy potato skillet was a practical one-dish meal that fed a family of 4 for under $1. The gravy made cheap ingredients taste expensive, and the skillet method meant no oven heat during summer months when kitchens were already too hot. Creamy spinach rice bake wasn't health food. It was supper when frozen spinach and rice were all you could manage. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Dump 1 box of frozen chopped spinach into a casserole dish without thawing. Add 1 cup of uncooked instant rice. Pour 1 can of cream of mushroom soup over the top. Add 1 cup of water. Stir once to break up the frozen spinach. Sprinkle shredded cheese on top if you had it. Cover with foil. Bake at 350 degrees for 35 minutes. The smell was earthy spinach and mushroom. The taste was creamy: soft spinach, fluffy rice, rich soup, melted cheese. It cost about 60 cents in 1965. Frozen spinach from the freezer section, instant rice from the box, cream of mushroom soup from the pantry, cheese from the block. This worked because frozen spinach lasted forever in the freezer, instant rice cooked fast, cream of mushroom soup kept on the shelf for years, and cheese was optional but added richness. By the 1990s, fresh spinach became more affordable and available year-round in grocery stores, and frozen spinach casseroles started feeling outdated. During the 1960s and 70s, creamy spinach rice bake was a practical way to eat green vegetables when fresh options were limited or expensive. The cream of mushroom soup masked the metallic taste that frozen spinach sometimes had, and the rice stretched the dish into something filling. Cheese on top made it feel indulgent, and the one-dish method meant minimal cleanup. Sausage biscuit cream bake wasn't breakfast. It was supper when breakfast sausage and refrigerated biscuits were all you had left. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of breakfast sausage in a skillet, drain half the grease, but leave some for flavor. Dump the sausage into a casserole dish. Pour 1 can of cream of chicken soup over the top. Add half a cup of milk. Stir once. Top with refrigerated biscuits straight from the tube. Bake at 375 degrees for 25 minutes until the biscuits were golden. The smell was browned sausage and buttery biscuits. The taste was rich. Savory sausage, creamy gravy, fluffy biscuits. It cost about $1.10 in 1965, breakfast sausage at 60 cents per pound, cream of chicken soup from the pantry, milk from the bottle, refrigerated biscuits from the tube. This worked because breakfast sausage was cheap and flavorful, cream of chicken soup kept forever, milk was always on hand, and refrigerated biscuits baked fast. No chopping, no mixing beyond 1 quick stir, just brown, dump, pour, top, bake. Some families cracked eggs into the sausage mixture before topping with biscuits to make it more substantial, but plain sausage and gravy was more common. The meal stayed wildly popular at church breakfasts, brunch gatherings, and family dinners through the 1990s, where it was called biscuits and gravy casserole or sausage gravy bake. Children loved it because it tasted like breakfast for dinner. Adults appreciated it because it was filling, flavorful, and required minimal effort. The sausage provided protein and fat, the biscuits provided carbs, and the cream soup turned everything into a cohesive, gravy-covered dish. Creamy chicken toast cube casserole wasn't bread pudding. It was supper when leftover chicken and stale bread were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Here, leftover chicken into pieces, dump it into a casserole dish, tear stale bread or toast into cubes and scatter them over the chicken. Pour 1 can of cream of chicken soup mixed with half a cup of milk over everything. Press the bread cubes down so they soaked up the liquid. To sprinkle with black pepper. Bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The smell was toasted bread and chicken. The taste was comforting. Soft bread cubes, tender chicken, creamy gravy. Cost about 60 cents in 1955. Leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, stale bread or leftover toast from the bread box, cream of chicken soup from the pantry, milk from the bottle. This worked because chicken lasted 3 days in the icebox. Stale bread was always around, cream of chicken soup kept forever, and milk was a staple. No chopping beyond tearing, no mixing beyond 1 quick stir, just tear, dump, pour, press, bake. Some families added frozen peas or diced celery to the chicken layer, or sprinkled shredded cheese on top before baking, but plain chicken and toast cubes was more common. The meal stayed popular at church suppers and family dinners through the 1970s, where it was called chicken strata, or toast casserole. But for seniors living alone, creamy chicken toast cube casserole was a practical way to use leftovers without waste. The bread cubes absorbed the soup and chicken juices, turning into something that tasted like savory bread pudding. The texture was soft and custard-like, not dry like regular casseroles, but moist and cohesive. By the 1980s, store-bought croutons replaced torn toast, and homemade casseroles started feeling old-fashioned. But during the 1950s and 60s, creamy chicken toast cube casserole was a practical one-dish meal that turned stale bread and leftover chicken into something new. The cream soup made it taste rich, and the toast cubes gave it structure. Some people loved the soft, pudding-like texture. Others found it too mushy. But for seniors too tired to cook fresh food, creamy chicken toast cube casserole was fast, filling, and used what was already in the kitchen. Beefy cornmeal skillet bake wasn't tamale pie. It was supper when ground beef and cornmeal were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef in an oven-safe skillet. Drain the grease. Stir in 1 can of tomato sauce and 1 can of corn with the liquid. Bring it to a simmer. Mix 1 cup of cornmeal with 1 cup of water and half a teaspoon of salt in a bowl. Pour the cornmeal mixture over the beef. Spread it smooth. Bake at 400 degrees for 25 minutes until the cornmeal crust was golden. The smell was browned beef and baked cornbread. The taste was layered. Savory beef filling, slightly sweet corn, crispy cornmeal topping. It cost about 90 cents in 1965, ground beef at 50 cents per pound, tomato sauce from the can, corn from the can, cornmeal from the box. This worked because ground beef was cheap and tomato products stacked on the shelf forever. And corn was a staple and cornmeal was one of the cheapest grains. No casserole dish, no extra pans, just 1 oven-safe skillet. Some families added chili powder or cumin to the beef for a southwestern flavor, or stirred shredded cheese into the cornmeal batter. Plain beef and cornmeal was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1980s in the South and Southwest, where cornmeal was a kitchen staple. For most Americans outside those regions, cornmeal was considered old-fashioned or poverty food, something your grandparents ate during the Depression. Younger generations preferred wheat flour or rice, and cornmeal fell out of everyday use. But for seniors living alone, Beefy cornmeal skillet bake was a practical one-dish meal that used cheap ingredients and delivered protein, vegetables, and starch all in one pan. By the 1990s, Tex-Mex flavors became trendy, and cornmeal returned in the form of cornbread mix and polenta. But during the 1960s and 70s, Beefy cornmeal skillet bake was a practical casserole that cost less than $1 and fed 4 people. The cornmeal topping baked into a crust that was crispy on top and soft underneath, soaking up the beef juices like a sponge. The tomato sauce and corn made the filling tangy and slightly sweet, and the cornmeal balanced it with a neutral, grain-forward flavor. The first 25 casseroles were fast, cheap, and filling: beef gravy potato, creamy spinach rice, sausage biscuit cream, chicken toast cubes, and beefy cornmeal. But the final 5 go into the softest territory: creamy white beans, chicken and dumplings, creamed vegetable bread bake, beef and onion gravy, and creamy pantry pasta skillet. Creamy white bean casserole wasn't vegetarian cooking. It was supper when canned beans and cream soup were cheaper than meat. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Open 2 cans of white beans, navy beans or Great Northern beans. Drain and rinse them. Dump them into a casserole dish. Pour 1 can of cream of celery soup over the top. Add half a cup of milk. Stir once. Sprinkle with black pepper and a handful of shredded cheese. If you had it, bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The smell was mild beans and creamy soup. The taste was soft. Tender beans, rich cream sauce, slightly salty. It cost about 50 cents in 1965. 2 cans of white beans from the pantry, cream of celery soup from the shelf, milk from the bottle, cheese from the block. This worked because canned beans lasted for years, cream of celery soup kept forever, milk was always on hand, and cheese was optional. No soaking dried beans overnight. No hours of simmering. Just open, rinse, dump, pour, bake. Some families added diced ham or crumbled bacon to make it heartier, or stirred in diced onions and celery for extra flavor. But plain white beans and cream soup was more common. By the 1990s, white beans became trendy in Mediterranean and Italian cooking, rebranded as cannellini beans. and served with olive oil and herbs. During the 1960s and 70s, creamy white bean casserole was a practical casserole that cost less. Others found it too bland and added hot sauce or mustard at the table. Some seniors made variations: pinto beans instead of white beans, cream of mushroom soup instead of celery, or crushed crackers on top for crunch. But the classic version remained canned white beans, cream of celery soup, and milk, a Depression-era casserole that stretched cheap beans into a complete meal. But if white beans felt too plain, what came next was more substantial and used dumplings. Chicken and dumpling bake wasn't traditional chicken and dumplings. It was supper when leftover chicken and biscuit mix were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Tear leftover chicken into pieces, dump it into an oven-safe skillet, pour 1 can of cream of chicken soup mixed with 1 cup of milk over the chicken, bring it to a simmer on the stove, drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough on top, made from a cup of biscuit mix and a 1/3 cup of milk, cover with a lid, bake at 375 degrees for 20 minutes until the dumplings were cooked through. The smell was chicken and doughy biscuits. The taste was comforting: tender chicken, creamy gravy, fluffy dumplings. It cost about $1 in 1965, leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, cream of chicken soup from the pantry, milk from the bottle, biscuit mix from the box. This worked because chicken lasted 3 days in the icebox. Cream of chicken soup kept forever, milk was always on hand, and biscuit mix was a pantry staple. No rolling dough, no cutting dumplings, just drop spoonfuls of batter on top and bake. Some families added frozen peas or diced carrots to the chicken mixture, or sprinkled black pepper on the dumplings, but plain chicken and dumplings was more common. The meal stayed wildly popular at family dinners and church suppers through the 1990s, where it was called easy chicken and dumplings, or biscuit-topped chicken. Children loved it because the dumplings were soft and the gravy was rich. Adults appreciated it because it used leftovers and required minimal effort. The dumplings baked on top of the gravy and absorbed the chicken juices, turning fluffy and savory. But the classic version remained leftover chicken, cream of chicken soup, and biscuit mix dumplings, a Southern-inspired comfort meal that crossed regional boundaries because it was simple and satisfying. But if dumplings felt too heavy, what came next was lighter and used leftover vegetables. Creamed vegetable bread bake wasn't stuffing. It was supper when leftover vegetables and stale bread were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Dump any leftover cooked vegetables into a casserole dish: canned green beans, corn, peas, carrots, whatever was left. Tear stale bread into pieces and scatter them over the vegetables. Pour 1 can of cream of mushroom soup mixed with half a cup of milk over everything. Press the bread down so it soaked up the liquid. Sprinkle with salt and pepper. Bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The smell was mixed vegetables and toasted bread. The taste was mild: soft vegetables, creamy soup, bread that absorbed all the flavors. It cost about 40 cents in 1955. Leftover vegetables from yesterday's dinner, or canned vegetables from the pantry. Stale bread from the bread box. Cream of mushroom soup from the shelf. Milk from the bottle. This worked because leftover vegetables were free. Stale bread was always around. Cream of mushroom soup kept forever. And milk was a staple. No chopping, no cooking fresh vegetables. Just dump leftovers, tear bread, pour soup, bake. Some families added shredded cheese on top or stirred in leftover gravy instead of cream soup. But plain vegetables and bread was more common. The meals stayed regional through the 1970s in rural areas where wasting food was unacceptable and leftovers were always repurposed. But for most Americans, creamed vegetable bread bake was considered poverty food or farm food, something you ate when you had nothing else. Younger generations preferred fresh vegetables or threw leftovers away rather than baking them into casseroles. But for seniors living alone, creamed vegetable bread bake was a practical one-dish meal that used up everything in the icebox without waste. By the 1980s, microwaves and Tupperware made leftover storage easier, and fewer people baked leftovers into casseroles. But during the 1950s and 60s, creamed vegetable bread bake was a practical way to stretch yesterday's vegetables into today's supper. Beef and onion gravy bake wasn't pot roast. It was supper when ground beef, onions, and gravy were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef with 1 sliced onion in a skillet, drain the grease, dump the beef and onions into a casserole dish, pour 1 can of brown gravy over the top, add half a cup of water, stir once, bake at 350 degrees for 25 minutes. The smell was caramelized onions and rich gravy. The taste was savory. Tender beef, sweet onions, thick brown sauce. It cost about 80 cents in 1965, ground beef at 50 cents per pound, 1 onion from the bin, brown gravy from the can. This worked because ground beef was cheap. Onions were cheap, and canned brown gravy kept on the shelf for years. No casserole topping needed, no starch required, just beef, onions, and gravy baked together. Some families served it over mashed potatoes or rice, but plain beef and onion gravy was a complete meal on its own. Others added sliced mushrooms or diced bell peppers to the beef mixture, but plain beef and onions was more common. The meal stayed popular at family dinners through the 1980s, where it was called hamburger and gravy, or beef bake. Children loved it because the onions turned sweet and the gravy made everything rich. Adults appreciated it because it was simple, cheap, and required minimal effort. The onions caramelized during browning and added natural sweetness that balanced the savory beef and salty gravy. By the 1990s, to prepackaged gravy mixes and jarred gravy replaced canned gravy, and ground beef casseroles started feeling outdated. But during the 1960s and 70s, beef and onion gravy bake was a practical one-dish meal that cost less than $1 and fed 4 people. The gravy soaked into the beef and onions, creating a thick, rich sauce that tasted like slow-cooked pot roast, even though it took only 10 minutes to prepare. Some seniors made variations, ground pork instead of beef. Creamy pantry pasta skillet wasn't a recipe. It was supper when leftover pasta and whatever else you had in the pantry were all that remained. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Cook any pasta shape until soft. Elbow macaroni, egg noodles, spaghetti broken into pieces, whatever was left. Drain and dump it into a skillet. Add 1 can of cream soup, mushroom, chicken, celery, whatever was on the shelf. Stir in half a cup of milk. Add any leftover cooked meat or canned meat, chicken, tuna, ham, whatever was left. Heat on the stove until everything was warm. Sprinkle with cheese if you had it. The smell was creamy soup and soft pasta. The taste was mild. Tender pasta, rich sauce, whatever protein you added. It cost about 60 cents in 1965, leftover pasta from yesterday, or cream soup from the pantry, milk from the bottle, leftover meat or canned meat. This worked because pasta lasted for days in the icebox, cream soup kept forever, milk was always on hand, and leftover meat could be stretched. No oven, no casserole dish, just 1 skillet. Some families added frozen peas or canned mushrooms for extra substance, or stirred in leftover vegetables, but plain pasta and cream soup was more common. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when pantry cooking was a necessity for families on tight budgets. But for most Americans, pantry pasta became a joke. But for seniors living alone, creamy pantry pasta skillet was a practical one-dish meal that used whatever was left without waste. By 30 one-dish casseroles that kept families fed when time ran out and the cupboard was nearly empty. Creamy chicken biscuit bakes, hamburger rice skillets, beef gravy over potatoes, none of it was fancy. It was what you made when you had 10 minutes, one pan, and whatever was left in the pantry. Your grandmother mixed everything together, baked it fast, and called it supper.